Well, first, I think it's very important to clarify one common misunderstanding about affirmative action. Affirmative action was not one thing, like discrimination, it was many. And the application of racial or gender or national origin preferences, right, were simply one very small portion of larger programs of affirmative action. The most important element of affirmative action programs in the United States throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s was the use of a model of parity analysis, where employers were required to self-examine, to look at the representation of different protected groups in different job classifications, and then to compare the proportions of members of protected groups, blacks, Latinos and Chicanos, women, in certain job categories, with their representation in the geographically relevant qualified labor market. And to the extent that statistical analysis showed that there was a disparity between availability and representation, employers were required, and some took on voluntarily, to self-examine, to figure out, okay, where are the obstacles to the inclusion of minority groups and women in our selection procedures, in our recruitment procedures? Do we have attitudinal problems on the part of the people making selection decisions? And then to change social practices within the organization, to remove those barriers, and to set specific goals and timetables for the achievement of parity between representation in the labor market and representation in the employment context. And so to this extent, I want to echo something that Robert has written about in other contexts, that race, or I would argue also gender, is not a physical attribute or a natural category. It is a social practice, or it is a collection of social practices. And if we wish to address racism or racial stratification or gender stratification effectively, we have to examine our social practices and we have to examine their actual effects. And without doing that kind of numerical analysis, we will only have myths about the effect of our institutionalized practices. We won't have actual information. We would never approach a public health problem that way, a problem of improving productivity that way. And so I find it suspicious, to be honest, when a society, be it the United States or France or elsewhere, says essentially through its political, through its laws, we will now just be colorblind. Everyone will be equal. We're not going to look at this anymore. Well, it seems to me that that operates to continue entrenched patterns of subordination.
Okay, go ahead, Christopher.
Well, I think it's important that this not be seen simply as a US phenomenon, because that, with some of the best will in the world, can attract the wrong sense of its importance and its applicability in the European context. What's really important is that the American model has been shown to be successful in the European context as well, within the constraints of European community law. So it's not just now an American phenomenon, it's also, in terms of the way that Linda's described it, operating, for example, in Northern Ireland, where I come from. So in the context of the extremely important historical divisions within that community between Catholics and Protestants, it has been an extremely successful model in terms of changing the labour market in the Northern Ireland context. And I've just been doing research which is demonstrating just that. So it's important to see that it can be done in the European context within the constraints of European law and within the proportionality analysis that we expect to apply to social policy in the European context.
So if I could just build on that for a second. Christopher, at the outset of the program, was talking about the different goals which you use law to try to achieve. So to go back to this goal of diversity, which we were talking about, diversity comes into the law in the United States in the context of education, where, as opposed to employment, in which you want to have a conversation between many different sorts of persons. And it very quickly became allied with the notion of multiculturalism, which is to say the pride of groups in their own achievement, in their own potential contribution to a conversation with other groups. This would have roots in the French context back to Fritz Fanon's work, for example. A transvaluation of one's own sense of oneself. I am a subordinate, and now I'm an equal. And if we think about using law to transform the social meanings of race in the way that Linda's describing, not merely to provide equal justice and opportunity, but also to change the ways in which people conceive of themselves when they have a race, understand their own race in themselves, then this notion of diversity might have a little bit more work to play than simply in the workforce.
May I just comment on that? I think that's really very interesting. I think the problem in transferring a multiculturalism debate is sometimes the notion that these cultures remain, as it were, separate. And clearly in some contexts, I think in the French context, but also in the British context and several of the other contexts, that notion of retaining and reinforcing separateness, I think, has problems attaching to it. So there's a very interesting debate that's occurring at the moment in Canada, where a recent very important report from Quebec, commissioned by the Quebec government, talks about interculturalism rather than multiculturalism. Now, what's important about that, I think, is the notion that there should be an interconnectedness of the cultures that are involved rather than a separation. And that seems to me to be a rather nice notion in the context of France and other European countries as well.
Of course, multiculturalism is one of the central themes of the Canadian Constitution, the Australian Constitution, and so on.
But they're talking now about interculturalism because of the potential problems that it gives rise to.
We're down to our last couple minutes now, so let me end on which might perhaps be the most difficult question of all. Because of immigration and globalization today, are issues of discrimination and inequality just becoming constantly more challenging to deal with in the context of especially Western democracies in Europe and the United States? Linda?
I wouldn't say they're more difficult to deal with. I would say that they're more important to deal with, that the problem is more critical now. And it shifts somewhat, it seems to me, the ends of anti-discrimination law. In a globalized context, multiculturalism is not a choice, it's a necessity. Multicultural literacy, or intercultural literacy, whatever language you want to use, is essential, not only in business, but also just in relations between peoples as borders dissolve with time.
Okay. Go ahead, Christopher.
I agree with that, but globalization also provides an opportunity as well as an extra challenge. And I think it's really quite important in the European context to come back to that opportunity. France would not have the law that it has now, an anti-discrimination law, were it not for the European community. The European community is a globalized institution. So laws and the extent to which you can place those laws within a broader context can sometimes help to overcome some of the parochialism that each of our countries shares.
Okay.
The other element, if I may, I'm sorry.
10 seconds. Go ahead.
Is simply that there are connections between countries at the level of community participation. In other words, ideas travel. So do groups. So does organization.
Okay.
French employers can no longer think of themselves simply operating in France. They're operating in a global context where NGOs are also active.
Okay, Robert, I apologize. I won't let you get final words in because the clock is against us. We are completely out of time, unfortunately, for this edition of the debate. So I'd like to thank our panelists so much for joining us. Thank our viewers for tuning in as well. That is all for tonight. Another edition then tomorrow. Do join us then. Bonsoir.